Hello and welcome to the Institute of Early Years Education. My name is Sinead McMahon and I'm the Content Manager here at the Institute, and I'm joined today by one of our content writers, Emily Askew. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. Whether you are joining us live or watching the recording on catch-up, we do hope that you find the session valuable as we explore what the term disadvantage means in early education and care, and think about what we can do during this vital phase of a young child's life to work towards reducing the attainment gap, which is another term that we will explore more fully during this webinar. First of all, we know that the early years are a prime time for setting the foundations for active and engaged learning. And we also know that the home learning environment is a key influencer in supporting these outcomes. And there is so much research that supports the unrivaled impact that an effective home learning environment and effective high quality provisions outside of the home can have on a child's future outcomes, well-being and development. And part of this research is built on the evidence of the disparity in outcomes for those who have high quality opportunities and those who do not. So in this webinar, we are going to be exploring the role of early education and care provisions and professionals when it comes to supporting children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and consider just how significant this period of learning and growth can be when it comes to narrowing the attainment gap, which is something that is referred to quite a lot in terms of education. So first of all, let's just explore what is the attainment gap. And I've just got this quote here to share with you from the Sutton Trust and a report that they put out, The Inequality in Early Years Education, which was published earlier this year. There is a substantial gap in development between the poorest children and their better off peers before they start school. The early years are crucial to narrowing this gap. So the attainment gap refers to the disparity or the difference in the attainment and learning outcomes achieved by children from disadvantaged backgrounds when compared to their peers from better off backgrounds. This is a gap that is established as young as the early years, with a significant attainment gap being established in children as young as 5 years old. There is a growing bank of evidence to suggest the lifelong impact of educational inequality and the importance of providing high quality opportunities for learning and development, starting at the earliest opportunity in the early years. And in fact, figures tell us, in terms of economic benefits, the research has found high quality early education to have a 13% return on investment, and that for every pound spent on early years education, £7 has to be spent to have the same impact in adolescence, so when a child is older. So that's quite a significant statistic. So just to unpack a little bit more on what it means. So in terms of in the early years in particular, disadvantaged pupils have on average lower attainment than other pupils, and this gap widens as pupils progress through their education, so later on. And in this diagram here, based on data from 2022, we can see that the disadvantage gap shown there in the early years, in the reception year, at the end of reception year, among pupils aged 5 is 4.8 months. So that gap is measured in terms of the months of difference of progress. However, in 2023, that gap did reduce slightly to 4.6 months. So it was going in the right direction. Now, whilst the indicators for potential, areas of disadvantage have varied, research by the Nuffield Foundation highlights the impact that family household income has on educational outcomes, and therefore indicators such as free school meals or pupil premium or early years pupil premium or eligibility for 15 hours of funding in the previous model that was used are substantial indicators for disadvantage due to their eligibility requirements, which relate to household income. And when we look at the statistics arising in early years, this data is based on the end of reception. So at the end of reception year, where the children's if their ability in terms of early learning goals, whether they've met their early learning goals and a good level of development, that informs that data for us. As we can see, there is an effective predictor used commonly in research for understanding elements of disadvantage and the potential barriers to quality education. As I've said earlier, so prior to this data, the gap had been narrower prior to COVID, but then that gap started to widen again. And like I say, between 2022 and 23, there was a slight reduction again, which is positive. So if we also just think about that statistic that I mentioned in the previous slide, that thought of spending £1 in the early years, how impactful that can be, and to be more cost effective than having to invest then this, say, the £7 to have that same impact for a child during their adolescence. It really kind of draws out to us just how important it is as early years educators and professionals to work towards reducing that gap as effectively as we can whilst the children are with us in the early years. I'm going to pass on to Emily now, and she's going to talk a little bit more about what disadvantage means.
Thank you. Okay, so when we think about disadvantage, it's firstly really important to acknowledge that everyone's experiences are very different. So what is considered to be disadvantaging to one person is completely different for another family or individual. Disadvantaged, as you can see in this slide, I've put quotation marks around dis to highlight that perfect example of the idea that actually disadvantage is very different to an advantage based on the same circumstances, but different contexts for different individuals. So disadvantage is a term that we use generally to describe children who are facing additional barriers to success. However, just as Sinead said about the general statistics that are used to highlight the general ways in which we approach disadvantage from a research perspective and a quantitative perspective particularly, defining exactly what we mean by disadvantage is complex because it can manifest in so many different ways. So we must ensure that the language that we use reflects the children's own views, as well as the grown-ups that are involved in their care and education, but also being very mindful not to label children based on those experiences and demographics that we know about. So while state-defined disadvantage, the statistics that have been mentioned before, are really useful for giving us a reference on a wider scale for longitudinal research that really helps us to understand and unpack the longitudinal long impact of disadvantage on educational outcomes, it fails to acknowledge those individual experiences, the real niches of the families that you work with. And those circumstances are different that make it a very different experience for one family or individual compared to another. For example, the free school meals eligibility that we've talked about previously is something that is based on household income. It's something based on the annual financial income of the household that the Child Poverty Action Group in 2022 highlighted that 1 in 3 school-age children in England are living in poverty and missing out on these free school meals because of the restrictive eligibility criteria. So although a child might be eligible for free school meals, it doesn't necessarily capture everyone who's experiencing disadvantage because of those qualities. Instead, we might think about disadvantage from a perspective of additional barriers. So instead of using the labels of those areas to categorize children or families into certain types based on their living experiences, we might look at the additional barriers that they face instead. This is really useful to think about how barriers can be overcome. We can jump over them, we can knock them down, we can move them out of the way. And it really helps to highlight the idea that disadvantage isn't a static state. It's not a fulfilled prophecy where once a disadvantage, always a disadvantage. So in this respect, we might use something along the lines of the example shown here, looking at SEND. We know that SEND is a category that highlights educational outcome disparities based on the support that's available, the recognition and diagnostic criteria, and the support that's widely available, almost as a postcode lottery in some respects. So if we look at this example here, over on the side, quality education and care is represented as one kind of block, and the different circumstances in which SEND might be operated are in the different colours shown here. So if we're looking at a child who has a recognised SEND need and is fully supported in that capability, whether through an educational plan, it might be that they have a one-to-one, they have a real kind of home learning environment that is supported in managing children's expectations and outcomes, we can see that it does still give a barrier. It's something that we recognise there are additional challenges along the way and support is needed for that. but it's not a total barrier to accessing quality early education and care at the same kind of equity and equality as the other children that they might be in a setting with who do not have a SEND diagnosis or additional need. Similarly, we might look at a child who has an identified SEND need, whether it be an additional need that is a physical need, it might be something that is identified and is diagnosed or is in the process of being diagnosed, but nonetheless, it's been recognised by a professional or by a parent and carer and is being addressed. However, due to this, often where diagnostic criteria are concerned, if a child isn't officially diagnosed, it can lead to limited provision. It might be that that child is on a waiting list to be diagnosed and once diagnosed would be deemed appropriate for a one-to-one that they can't access before then. Those kind of processes and policies that are in place sometimes make it a little bit more difficult to access the same kind of provision that they might do once fully diagnosed. In this case, we recognise that because they've had a recognised SEND additional need, there is limited provision in place to the best of the capabilities in that context, and therefore that barrier is slightly wider. It's something that is still allowing them to access certain provisions, but may not be doing everything that it possibly could to reduce those barriers. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got unrecognised and unsupported children who have potential additional needs, but there's no kind of recognition in place for that. If there's no recognition and there's no support, that would lend itself to a much greater barrier for children who are experiencing those additional challenges and therefore at a greater disadvantage because those needs aren't being met in the same way. That's just one way to think about disadvantage as something that is very subjective to the individual and the context and faces loads of different kind of criterias that vary from person to person. So it's really important from this to really think about what disadvantage means for that individual child and not to be looking at labels as the be all and end all of their experiences. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what disadvantage means in the policies and the reports. We've talked a lot about what it might mean to the individual, but what can we as professionals actually do about it? There are a few tips that we want to offer here. They're not the entire be all and end all. And one of the biggest things that I would recommend is talking on your local level, either in your individual setting or as part of your local council to see what is offered in your specific area. There might be different initiatives and plans based on your context and your demographic that might be of best support for you. But the attainment gap is a big issue that is influenced by policy directives across all sorts of sectors that support families, from our early education and care through to prenatal healthcare and all the way around until a child has grown up fully. And even then, we're looking to support in other areas too. So it's important that children and their families have quality provisions to access, as well as the meaningful opportunities in the home learning environment. As professionals working with children in a setting or supporting teams of those who do, it's important that we're aware of the impact of indicators of deprivation and those influences on educational outcomes. We can't fix the world in a day, but by supporting children and their home learning environments, their parents and carers and wider families to recognise where those barriers might be in place, we can make smaller changes that make a big difference. So being aware and inclusive, what might seem like some to quite a simple task or an activity that is actually of most enjoyment to most people can actually cause great barriers for others. For example, if you're looking at fundraising days and community events where there is a sense of financial contribution, for most families that you're working with, that could be something that they deem to be part of their daily budget, and it could be something that actually promotes the community that you're aiming to facilitate. But for other families, it may lead to them feeling isolated and burdened with their own situations of financially tight. In this respect, it's causing exactly the opposite of what you're aiming to do and introduces a sense of isolation for certain families who might be struggling with an economic disadvantage. However, these circumstances need to be viewed to impact one family or another. As we've said before, disadvantage is something that is of a very individual nature, and dealing with those situations sensitively is of primary concern. For example, you don't want to be targeting every one of your families that are on an EYPP and reaching out to them in a different way to the families that are not, based on your knowledge of their financial eligibility. Having those sensitive conversations, if they're needed, is recommended, but how you go about this is very unique to the setting and the situation that you're in. As we've said before, these are not static factors, so we want to consider them instead as reframed potential barriers. And that in that way as well, we want to really give autonomy to the children and families that you're working with to be able to give language and lead on their defining of disadvantage. In this respect, as with all best practice, listening to the values and views of the children, as well as their grown-ups, is a great way to take on board how they view their own experiences, and particularly to take on board the language that they use so that you can replicate that in a comfortable way for them. This is something that is important to recognise to provide an inclusive and universal provision, because it's not always as straightforward as it seems to level that playing field. Factors such as coming from a single parent household or learning English as an additional language can be recognised as having those additional barriers to them, but not always so. They're often badges of pride and contribute to family diversity and cultural diversity that are part of and enhance part of an individual's identity rather than hinder it. So it's really important to let children define their own experiences, being open and giving objective explanations that are sensitive to others, rather than kind of leading the discussion with your own personal views. It's all about educating everyone that's in the room, but one top tip might be to talk as if there is someone in the room that has lived that experience, so that you can tailor your language to a way that isn't talking at somebody as a difference, as someone who isn't in the room and is kind of a different culture, a different characteristic to who is in your setting. Create equal opportunities to support children of all abilities, developmental stages, characteristics, and cultures in high quality learning opportunities that really cultivate that strong sense of cohesion and belonging. And it's something that we really try to do here at the Institute in terms of your professional identity. Making time for all families to propagate those really meaningful values and establish those connections in a relaxed and open setting, such as stay and play sessions or extended handover and parents' evenings, are a really good way to provide a genuine and authentic feel to the conversations that you have. We know that sometimes handovers at the end of the day are rushed, particularly if you've got 5 children left at 5 to 6 and everyone's rushing to get home for their tea. It can be really difficult to sustain that interaction with parents who are keen to pick up their other children from school maybe, or they have other pressures of their own in their personal lives that make it difficult to kind of keep them back and have that sustained sensitive interaction. It's about timing it in a really appropriate way, engaging when it's appropriate to have those conversations to get the most out of that fruitful relationship. And finally, it's really important to never assume and always support. We can be very aware that these kind of labels throughout education, there's masses of research to show that teacher labeling and self-fulfilling prophecies impact children not only in their early years, but all the way through their education. So it's really important that as professionals at the start of their educational journey, that we allow open and non-judgmental, unbiased and supportive conversations to take place that give them their place and their special recognition in the education that they deserve. So, next steps following from this webinar. We're really delighted that you've come along today to listen, and we hope that you found some inspiring and insightful knowledge to take forward in your practice. Please remember to log your CPD points using the My CPD under My account. This way you can provide a little bit of a reflection of your top tips, maybe look back at the recording later on to see if there's anything else that you missed, and give yourself a chance to really recognise the valuable CPD that you've done today. Otherwise, please don't forget to book on to our next webinar, Embracing the Outdoors as the Weather Turns, and that is on Wednesday, the 6th of November. And it will be looking at kind of how we embrace the outdoors when it gets a bit colder, it's darker earlier, how we can make those kind of experiences really fruitful and rich for our children. And I'll just pass over to Sinead.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I think that little reminder there for us to log those CPD points, which today will probably be for about 20 minutes, but just to have that reflection and think about what your key takeaways have been from this session. I know for me, I think it's really come across just that importance of relationships, keeping those strong relationships with our family so we can keep up to date with ever-changing circumstances, really taking on board the fact that, you know, disadvantage isn't something that's necessarily static, that we have to adjust our ways for the children as their circumstances change. So yes, some really good food for thought there. Really enjoyed that. Thank you, Emily. And then just before we round up today, just to remind you that to keep connected with us, we have got our social media channels live, so the details are there on the screen. If you're not already following us, then do please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and just keep connected. Keep your eyes peeled for new things that are coming out at the Institute, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.